Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's live webcast, eSource, Easier Than You Think. This is Lisa Henderson, editor for Applied Clinical Trials, and I'll be your moderator today. Today's webcast is being sponsored by OmniComm. As an EDC specialist, OmniComm understands the power that an information-driven clinical enterprise can bring to your clinical research organization. OmniComm is the only company that provides a choice of best-of-breed EDC platforms that are purpose-built for their unique clinical research environments, early phase, late phase, phase 1 through 4, device trials, or investigator-initiated. OmniComm brings the most advanced open and interoperable EDC platforms using innovative cloud technology and advanced API web services to provide its clients with the information needed to make insight-driven, clinical data-based critical decisions, bringing medical therapies to patients faster with lower risk. This is the reason why 4 out of 5 top CROs and 7 out of the 10 largest phase 1 clinics run OmniComm EDC technologies. And now we have some important announcements. This webcast is designed to be interactive, and we encourage you to ask questions during the event. You can submit questions by typing them in the Q&A box, which can be found by clicking on the red Q&A widget at the bottom of the presentation window. We will try to answer as many questions as we can. You can enlarge the slide window by clicking on the small green icon in the upper right-hand corner of the slide window, or by hovering your mouse over the lower right-hand corner and dragging the window to the desired size. The slides will advance automatically during the event. If you have any technical problems viewing or hearing this presentation, please click on the question mark help widget in the dock at the bottom of your presentation window. And now I would like to introduce today's speakers. Presenting today are Keith Howes, Senior Vice President Development, and John Fontenot, Senior Vice President Operations, both from OmniComm. Mr. Howes joined OmniComm in January 2011 with responsibility for the development and forward direction of the company's products. Mr. Howes has over 20 years of experience in building and implementing clinical research applications, including 5 years as head of development for Oracle's Pharmaceutical Application Suite and 5 years as head of development for Medidata Solutions. This encompasses applications for clinical data management, EDC, medical dictionary coding, safety, trial planning, and trial budgeting. Mr. Howes has a degree in physics from Oxford University in England. John Fontenot is a clinical data operations and data systems executive with over 24 years of pharmaceutical industry experience. Prior to joining OmniComm, Mr. Fontenot was Vice President Operations at ER², providing strategic e-clinical business process and technology change management and adoption services to large and small-sized sponsors and CROs. Prior to ER², Mr. Fontenot was Executive Director and Global Head of Clinical Data Management and Technology at Kendall International, which is now INC Research, where he was responsible for a staff of 500 in 13 locations worldwide. And prior to Kendall, Mr. Fontenot held positions of increasing responsibility at Bayer. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And John, why don't you get us started?
Okay, thank you very much, Lisa. Thank you all very much for joining us today. I'm happy to be here with you. I think we have some very exciting topics to share with you today. eSource and clinical trials, that's a topic that raises many opinions and clearly evident by the numbers of presentations and multitude of various white papers that you might find and listen to at industry conferences, especially since the release of the guidance documents over the last several years and certainly since the release of the final guidance document from the FDA. It's a topic that's been around well before the guidances. It's also a practice that's actually been in place well before the guidances. So it's kind of interesting, while there may be, some controversial issues or some technically challenging aspects around eSource, it's still being done today, and we think it can be easier than you think. So with that, just a short note here. We're going to split the presentation today into a couple of different segments. I'm going to cover first some background around eSource and go through the survey results that was conducted by Applied Clinical Trials. And then I'm going to hand it off to Keith, and he's going to jump in and present some interesting practical examples of technologies enabling eSource data capture. So just a short agenda from my part. I'm going to talk about some eSource essentials and then go into a bit about the guidance, where we see adoption today, and then move into the survey results, and then finish up with some highlights of what we see our customers doing. So because we may have a varied crowd on the phone today with some different backgrounds, I thought I'd start with just kind of level setting some terminology. So I think everyone should probably know that eSource stands for electronic source data. Basically that is data that in its original state, upon being created or generated, is electronic, and it really can't be traced back to another source previous to that or prior to that data being in that electronic origin. eSource is essentially comprised of data elements, and those data elements are in themselves really are the smallest piece of evidence that are captured as part of that eSource. The origination of the eSource is really critical to plan and document, in particular when we refer to audit trail information in clinical trials. And then with respect to the term eCRF in conjunction here with eSource, the eCRF really serves as a consolidation point for all data. So some of that data might be eSource, some of that data might not be eSource. From a clinical trials perspective, the eCRF system really provides the overall framework for clinical trial workflow. So whether it be from a data management perspective, a site perspective, or others involved in the clinical trial process, it provides that framework for that overall workflow. So a little bit more on the definition side. This is really kind of as it's defined in the guidance document. There's a number of kind of data origins that are identified there. So we'll start first with what we call certified individuals. So these could be different individuals that are involved in the clinical trial process that are really certified to that on the creation side of data. So it could be clinical investigational staff, like investigators themselves, or study coordinators, technicians that are involved in the process, or it could potentially be subjects themselves. And this is with respect in particular to direct manual capture of data into eCRFs. Then there's also the data collection from instruments, and when I say instruments here, I'm talking for the most part around ePRO type instruments, so whether they be validated questionnaires or diary type of information. Data coming from medical devices, so blood pressure monitors, EKG machines, central systems that we're all pretty familiar with, I would imagine, laboratory systems, ECG data that we might receive from a core lab, and then also really a multitude of various electronic health record systems that are out there today, also as a potential eSource. So let's talk about the guidance for a bit. I'm not really going to rehash, the entire guidance here in this meeting, but I think there are, some very salient points that I'd like to try to lift out of the guidance here, and just kind of for us to level set the discussion. While there are other methods of consolidating eSource data, essentially the eCRF really remains generally seen as the consolidation point, and also as the point of workflow control, as I mentioned before. So there are other approaches, but for the sake of this presentation today and the discussions around this, we're going to be focused really around the eCRF. Data element identifiers. Really, these are bits of information that identify the data origin, and they really should be found in an audit trail. It's recommended that consistency checks are used in conjunction with eSource capture to identify any data anomalies. One of the things that the guidance document focuses on as well is that, and it's probably one of the more controversial areas related to eSource, is the capture of data manually directly into an eCRF. So really here we're talking about not using some other source like a shadow document or some other document that could be considered the original record. And according to the guidance, it's not only permissible, but it's very much encouraged. If you followed the presentation that followed the issuance of the final guidance, they actually refer to the use of that shadow document or the transcription from a document like that as actually the worst case scenario in their estimation. So generally speaking here, I'm sorry, and with respect to Part 11, the guidance does talk about Part 11 a little bit, but it was specifically focused on and referring to electronic health record systems, implying that really those systems would not necessarily be governed under Part 11, as they would probably be governed under other guidances. So really, I think the overall tone of the guidance is that there's general encouragement of strong adoption. And again, that was very much so reinforced in the presentation that was given by the FDA in January of 2014. So a little bit about adoption. Where do we see that at this point? I think at this point the benefits are very clear. The benefits are generally known. Faster data, elimination of SDV for eSources, data can be much more accurate. The elimination of various efforts like data transcription. The conversation certainly around eSource has matured. There's a tremendous amount of information out there today, a lot of conference presentations, white papers, guidance interpretations. The buzz is very strong, and the environment is certainly very ripe for further adoption. A bit of, and what you'll see in the survey data, commonly eSourced data is still obviously quite prevalent. So bringing in central lab data from an eSource, central ECG data, IVR data, those types of data sources are very commonly used and very strong today. So while there have been strides in the adoption of data exchange standards, not all vendors and systems really can support these standards at this time. So that, as we go through some of the hurdles here that are limiting the widespread of adoption, that is clearly one. Some organizations are still a bit reluctant to adopt the direct manual data capture into eCRFs without there being another source of that documentation. Or it could be that the environment in those situations is really not logistically conducive to really capturing data directly into these into the eCRFs. And then really there's still some ambiguity regarding the investigator control of the original source of the data. So meaning that, like, if the original source is directly entered into a system and the system is not under direct control of the investigator, this can be interpreted as a lack of control by the investigator, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Okay, so with that, let's roll into the results of the survey that Applied Clinical Trials conducted. We'll start with, just advance the slide for you. Let me start with just a quick overview here of some of the demographics of the folks that responded to the survey. We've had about 70 responders total. The majority of them are from the clinical operations area or others, closely related to that area or in some kind of a support role. And I apologize for the axis underneath the first graphic there on the left. It got a little bit squished in the presentation today. The highest percentage there, the highest line on the right is 30%. So you can see then the distribution of the responders by job function. The center pie chart is a breakdown of the organizational types that were represented. Little over 2/3 of them are from the CRO and biopharma space. And we also had some representation there from academia and the medical device space and consultants. Top right graph depicts that we pretty much had a broad set of exposure across multiple phases of studies. So folks that responded really had exposure across all those different phases. And the bottom right graph, kind of interesting distribution in the size of the companies that were represented by the responders. You can see that most of them fell into the very large company size or the very small company size. There was some representation in the middle as well, but certainly not as much as the largest and the smallest. So let's move on to the questions in the survey. So we'll start with, what percentage of site source records and documents are currently maintained on paper? And you can see here across all study phases, we had at least half of the folks feel that greater than 50% of the source documents are maintained on paper. The next largest range of responders, making up the next largest segment, was really the 26 to 50%. So essentially, the majority of the responders were trending towards the larger percentages. And we can interpret that as an indicator of moderate adoption of eSource today. So the next logical question here in the survey was, what do you expect the percentages will be in 3 years' time? So across all study phases, again, and I apologize, the legend was corrected a bit here on the right-hand side. Excuse me, it was a little off before. What do you expect the percentages will be in 3 years? Across all the study phases, only about 10 responders chose the greater than 50%. So clearly a much higher count for the two middle sections as well. On the phase 1 side, in particular, a large number of responders answering less than 10%. So most likely an indication of probably some continued adoption of phase 1 automation systems, and those environments maybe being a bit more conducive to some of that direct data capture, as I was mentioning before. But generally an indicator that more widespread adoption is certainly expected by these responders. So when we asked everyone to rank the importance of these listed potential benefits of eSource, we see the highest rankings around data availability, around data quality, and facilitating remote monitoring. So really, in general, all the benefits that are listed here on this slide are indicated as favorable. I guess the only other note that I'll make here, not surprised to see that the reduction in work for site personnel, further down the list, and given a lower percentage, given the representation that we had from the companies involved in the response to the survey. So next question. When asked what are the biggest hurdles to widespread adoption, we see disparate technologies, immature technologies, and cost really as the primary indicators there. Interesting to me that only about 30% of the responders indicated incomplete regulatory guidance as a factor. So I think that actually says a lot for the maturity of the guidance documents and where we are today from a guidance perspective. Next. Which of these data sources are currently obtained and used by your organization as eSource? I think this is pretty much what we would expect to see at this point, given the adoption, with the highest figures really around laboratory data capture and EKG data capture. I think to me, though, it was kind of interesting that we really don't see a lot of disparity between many of the other categories. I would have expected the IRT category to be higher than what we see here on this graph, and so I was surprised that a lot of the other ones were very consistent. Next. So with respect to the importance of these data sources as part of eSource initiatives, we see folks here indicating importance really across the board, across all of these areas. I'm obviously not surprised to see laboratory data at the top and ECG data also very close to the top, again, as the most common type of eSource data that's really imported. I'm not surprised to see ePRO near the top either. That's also a good indicator, and also interesting, I think, in this case, me anyway, that EHR is not identified as more important. Given the buzz around electronic health records, I would have expected that to be a more relevant part of these organizations' eSource initiatives. So when asked what the target system is for the data that these organizations are e-sourcing, the eCRF or the EDC backend essentially was identified as the most important target. So that's interesting because I think that kind of ties in with the earlier statements in conjunction with the guidance, where from a guidance perspective, they see the eCRF really, or the eCRF system as the most important system for that. Essentially, again, because it's supporting the workflow around various sources of clinical data consolidated in one place. I was a little surprised to see 39% that don't know or are unsure, but perhaps that is related to their organization's maturity when it comes to what they plan to do with eSource. Next is when we asked whether eSource is a component of their organization's risk-based monitoring strategy, we found that 32% indicated yes. Interesting, of those 32%, 79% of them actually considered eSource to be important as part of their strategy. So I find this a little surprising. The 32% really seems a bit on the low side to me, but perhaps this is more related to organizations really not having a well-defined risk-based monitoring strategy. I think Keith will talk a little bit more later on about the importance of eSource as part of risk-based monitoring and centralized monitoring strategies. So quickly here, what are the takeaways from the survey? Overall seems to be an indicator of more rapid or further adoption, at least expected more rapid or further adoption. That disparate technologies and cost are really the key hurdles for further adoption. eSource is generally seen as important to risk-based monitoring strategy for at least those that have an established risk-based monitoring strategy. Commonly, eSource data, such as laboratory data, ECG data, et cetera, is still being performed readily, consistently, and it's strong. And then on the last point here is that EDC really still seen as the target for the eSource data as a consolidation point. Okay, so that's really the results of the survey. I'd just like to move on with one additional slide from my part of the presentation today, just to share with you a little bit about OmniComm's experience when we looked across our metrics database to see what our customers were doing. This table represents the different types of eSource technologies that we have in our product, whether it's batch importing or using our APIs to integrate outside systems, or the use of some nice features that we have with respect to bringing on and incorporating attachments as an eSource. We see about 53% on the batch import side. Again, this is some of the stuff I've already mentioned before, like importing lab data, ECGs, but we're also seeing a number of other types of data being brought in, other sources of eCRFs being brought in to our system. Using the API pretty commonly, using external systems that support randomization, diary data, supplies, but also a lot of device data as well. So 33% of our folks using our API. And on the attachment side, which is kind of a growing feature within our technology, about 10% of studies using that, attaching a whole myriad of different types of files, instrument files, images. And my last point on the slide here is just to mention we actually have a couple of very interesting studies that are launching with our TrialMaster EDC product, and this particular client is using several types of eSource file attachments. So Holter monitor files, implantation device logs, ECGs as well. And interesting that they're probably going to result in about 100,000 attachments in the studies that they're running. And they're going to utilize these attachments, all these various attachments actually as part of their adjudication process. So we're very excited to see that mature and that play out for them. Okay, with that, I'm going to conclude my portion and hand over to Keith.
Great, thanks a lot, John. This is Keith Howells, and I'd like to now walk through the technical approaches to pulling this off. We'll be starting in roughly the same order as John introduced these principles: lab data and other kind of batch-loaded data, IVR data, i.e. things coming in through APIs. Some specific challenges if you want to read data directly from instruments. ePRO, everyone's talking about the patient-centered trial and encouraging patients to enter their own data. And there are now some new approaches that make the management of that much easier. And then kind of some thoughts on, well, how do you SDV eSource data so that you're sure that what you're getting in your final submission data sets is complete and accurate. So for lab data, this is probably the most proven. People have been doing this for a decade or more because the data is coming from a separately validated electronic source, a LIMS system of some kind. And what you want here is both the data and the ranges. It can be quite tedious to have to manually type in the ranges, so you want the ranges electronically as one file, and then the data as another file, obviously having correlated patient codes and visit codes and that kind of thing. And then you can automate loading that in, typically via an FTP directory, so the LIMS system will just broadcast the data to an FTP directory. A listener will pick that up, determine from where it's landed, what kind of file it is, and where it should be destined. We'll load it up, we'll run the edit checks, and then make that available in EDC. One of the benefits of doing that, rather than just sending it straight off into the data warehouse, is now the site personnel can interact with that. So if a value is high or low, you can prompt for clinical significance, which obviously the lab instrument itself doesn't know. So you're getting extra value out of that data if you can make it available to the site personnel. And you can also run edit checks on it. You know, if this particular lab value is high, then demand an adverse event page to go with it. So again, this is very well proven, very well established. And as John said, over half of our studies are doing this kind of thing. The next would be where you've got some external system. The most common would be an IVR, IWR system that's doing your randomization, your supplies tracking, and you want to coordinate that data with your EDC system so that your EDC system knows, say, this patient is randomized, so I open up all of the treatment visits for this patient. That is typically done through web service calls. Again, very, very established technology. It means that these two systems can be in separate data centers, separate applications, separate user management, but when anything happens, they are programmed to transmit that information to the twin system, typically using a CDISC ODM structure, which is an XML format. And then the response comes back, yes, okay, I've got that, so that the sending program knows that that data has indeed been coordinated. And this can happen in either direction. So we see, for instance, randomization coming out of the IVR system into EDC, and then some dispensing record in EDC going back to the IVR system, say, okay, my supply system needs to know that we just dispense some of this to a particular patient. So again, this is all very well established through API calls, normally using the CDISC ODM standard. I'd like to now highlight a particular technical challenge with directly reading from instruments. I hope this photo is easy enough to see. We've basically got a web-based application here and a barcode scanner here plugged into the USB port. Now, as we know, everything is cloud these days, which means your application is running in a browser. So it's running Chrome, it's running Firefox, it's running Internet Explorer. And the instrument, as I say, is plugged into a USB port. Well, by default, the browser is just not allowed to do that. That is just standard security rules for browsers. You wouldn't want to go to some website and have it say, oh, there's a thumb drive in the USB port and there's a file on it called passwords.txt. I think I'm going to read it. So browsers by design are just walled off from all of the COM ports on the machine it's running on, and basically all you're allowed to do is a file open, file save, where you're in control of what's going on. So when you want a browser-based application to go read things plugged into these COM ports, it's physically not allowed to do it. So there's a tension here between cloud-based computing and being able to access data directly from instruments. So what are the solutions for that? Well, if you've got dedicated instrument capture, that's actually a screenshot from a phase 1 or automation clinic system, then you can say, okay, well, I know this PC is dedicated to instrument capture, so I'm going to allow it to read the COM ports, and you can put in extra software. ActiveX is a Microsoft technology. You can also do it with Java. And then you've got to set some security controls, say, okay, I'm going to allow Internet Explorer to run these ActiveX components, and then this is allowed. So for dedicated, say, phase 1 clinics, this is absolutely fine. For the more general phases, you're just not going to get away with that. You're not going to be able to go to investigative site and convince them to change all their security settings on their browser, because they're there for a reason, to prevent viruses and so forth. So basically what it means is for non-dedicated PCs, for phase 2, 3, 4, and so forth, you can't have your web-based application directly talk to instruments. You've got to do it via some alternate route. So let's talk about what that alternate route might be. Here's a real example from an ECG machine. This is Mortara. We do a lot of work with them. They have a big percentage of the clinical research market. And the Mortara machine can produce an XML file. Here's an example of what it looks like. Oh, that's really tiny. I hope you could see some of that. But an XML file is basically a self-describing ASCII file. It has tags in it that says, well, I am the source, I am the patient number, I'm the visit number, I am the QR interval, whatever. So it's self-describing with the tag and the data. Well, if you've got a self-describing file, then you can teach that file to a batch loader, where you could say, okay, go find this tag, and that's the patient number, go find this tag, that's the visit number, go find that tag, and that's one of the data elements you want, and can then load that through the batch loader into an eCRF. So here's an example. Again, this is a real example of inspecting one of these XML files from Mortara and saying, okay, I found the time, I found the type, or resting, or whatever, and I've pulled out some of the intervals and durations that the protocol is demanding. And then, fascinatingly, you can then take the whole file and say, and now treat that as an attachment. So if you have an ECG viewer that can view the whole thing and actually see the traces, you can see that as well. So instead of having a paper strip that's off in some dungeon somewhere, it's all maintained electronically, and then whatever lab is actually analyzing this is able to access that from the eCRF, as is the site person, as is the sponsor person. So we're seeing this kind of hybrid of, well, I want to inspect the file to pull out the categorical data, and I want the whole file as an attachment so I can view it, to really give a lot of benefits. So to drill into just the general principle of attached files, it's fairly similar to just attaching a file to an email, something we all do without thinking. Just think of what it can mean if you can put that on a CRF. So it could be a scanned image, small DICOM images. We're doing studies, we're doing hand x-rays. Those are about 10, 15 megabytes in size, quite practical to attach the CRF. If you had a full MRI where it's a gigabyte, that's probably not practical. You'd want that in a separate imaging system with a link to it from the eCRF, but small images are fine, and then instrument files. They're stored as non-analyzable binary data, so treated as a blob binary large object, compress it and put it in the database. And it's really useful for referencing information and aiding communication during study conduct. So if a lead fell off this ECG, it would be very apparent that you could raise a query on that, and the site person said, oh yes, you're right, I'll go retake it. Just some key issues when you're doing that. You've got to redact any patient identifying information. So if whatever this thing is has got the patient name in there, you've got to make sure that disappears. You've got to maintain an audit trail if you're now treating this as clinical data. If it changes, you've got to be able to audit trail it. And when you finally produce the trial archives, which are typically a PDF rendition of the data, you want to be able to preserve that. So that link should still work. I should still be able to open that ECG trace. An FDA reviewer should still be able to open that ECG trace because you're now considering that as part of the clinical data. Now let's move on to ePRO. This is very volatile subject, really in vogue at all the conferences we go to, the idea of engaging the patient. And it's well proven that if you're capturing the data electronically, you get far better compliance, you get far better accuracy, notably about when the readings are for. But historically, that's been done with separate devices that are very expensive to administer and track, and the patient's got to carry around a Palm Pilot for their clinical trial in one pocket and their iPhone in their other pocket. And they are typically then communicating with the EDC system via these web service calls. So this is again well proven and certainly better than paper, but it is expensive. It does require a fair amount of management overhead. What we're doing and what we've seen a handful of other companies doing say, well, wait a minute, the patient should just be entering their data directly into the EDC system so that they don't need these separate devices and whatever. We don't have any separate handshaking. It's just a subset of the data that the patient enters themselves rather than the site enters on their behalf. So the principle is that the patient enters data directly into EDC, which means using the existing study design, edit checks, and calendar functions. But you can only do this as if you can provide extra security protections, because you've now got at the minimum their email address or their phone number, because that's the mechanism by which you authenticate. That's now in the clinical database. So this is a new wave of ways of doing things that introduces new considerations, because hitherto you would say all I've got about my patient in my clinical database is a number, you can't identify them from that. Well, now you've got something that potentially could, so you've got to be very, very careful in walling that off. So here's how it works. Let's say in our database we've got some regular users shown here in blue, and we've got some patient users shown here in green, and we've got our admin, which typically is a sponsor person or a CRO, who's setting these people up. So I've got a new coordinator at site 27. They send in a registration form or register online. We set them up. We know who they are. That's all fine because they're not actually part of the study. They're just administering the study. For the patient users, they have to have no access. They can see they're there. They can basically see an ID that is just inherited from the patient number, but other than that, they have no access to that. The reports show everything as blinded. The database has got that email address encrypted, and so even though they are there, sponsor personnel cannot see physically who they are. But obviously the site personnel know who these people are because they're physically taking the data, so they do have the access. So the way this is set up is the site coordinator can be granted a privilege to say, I'm going to set this patient up as a user. So obviously only for the patients in their site, they can enter that information. So now it's very, very routine. At screening visit, assuming the patient says, yes, I'm happy to enter my own data, a couple of fields to fill in, and bang, that user gets a notification, then they log on and change their temporary password and start entering the data. Just a couple of other features, if you can pull this off. Well, when they log on, what do they see? Well, just standard security mechanisms say, well, whatever is assigned to the patient role is what they see. When do they see them? You just set time windows that say, okay, it's got to be between this day and this day, or on this day between 8 a.m. and 10 a.m., and you demand that the data is entered only in that time window and shut them off outside that type window? How do they know it's needed? They would get email notifications. Can it be in a foreign language? Maybe. And the audit trail, obviously we've still got to audit trail this thing, and the audit trail entry would be ascribed to the patient ID. So again, you can see that the patient themselves entered this, but you can't tell who they are as an actual human being. So we think this is very exciting. We're sure it's something that the industry will take a while to contemplate and start to adopt. But again, we're just introducing this, and we've seen at least 3 other EDC vendors doing exactly the same thing. So this is really coming mainstream. The last fascinating topic is around SDV of eSource data. So if you read the guidance, it's very clear that the eCRF is considered the source. And I guess the thinking around this is, well, then that is the limit of my Part 11 compliance responsibility. I know anything that lands in there has to be Part 11 compliant, audit trailed, and secure access and all the rest of it, so I don't have to worry about Part 11 compliance of this guy or the EMR system or whatever. So from that perspective, this is very understandable, very defensible, but it complicates the active SDV, because SDV says, well, I'm going to go into my eCRF and I can compare it against the source data. Well, they're now one and the same thing, so it's impossible. But we don't want to just throw our hands up and say, well, I don't have to do it then, because if you got a bad reading, and who hasn't seen a miscalibrated blood pressure cuff, you're never going to be able to catch that, because again, you have no reference against which to compare the data in the eCRF. So how do you address that challenge? Well, what we're recommending is that you keep your instrument calibration records. Obviously, you'd be expecting your sites to do as well, but if you're starting to get into data from wearables, give all your patients a Fitbit to see how well they're moving. Well, how do you know that Fitbit's giving you valid data? So you're going to want to have basically any instrument that is giving you live data, giving you eSource data, to have calibration records. And then obviously the calibration records got some kind of device serial number against them. And what you want to do is then capture that device serial number in the audit trail. So not only do you know, well, here are the values, but it came from this instrument on this date. And now you can basically automate that SDV, because you can now say, okay, I'm going to take my audit trail entry that says this serial number on this date, and I'm going to do a lookup against my calibration record and say, yeah, I calibrated it before and after that date, and it was fine, and therefore I can trust all the readings in between. And I would say that that is highly defensible and something you can automate. You can write a program to do that rather than having to visually inspect it. And again, if you start to look at the volumes of data you get, say, from a wearable, it would just be inconceivable to try and do that by hand. You're getting orders of magnitude more data out of these things, and you've just got to be able to automate, therefore, the SDV of that. So here's an example, again, going back to this Mortara feed where we picked up the XML file. It's got a source tags in that XML file that we can pick up and define as elements of the audit trail. So we could pick a device name, a device serial number, and a device original timestamp, and have those picked up in batch loads or API calls, and drop that in the audit trail. And then again, that's now in a database, so we could write central monitoring reports that compare those audit trail entries against wherever our calibration records are stored. So in summary, for the technical side of eSource, there's a variety of ways of getting it into the system. Batch load is the most common, most established, and for high volume data, the most appropriate. Lab data would be the most common example. Web service calls where you've got lighter weight packets of data where the real-time synchronization is critical. I've just randomized a patient. I need the EDC system to know about it right now, not this time tomorrow. It can be done through instrument integration with the provisos of the complications about web-based applications directly reading COM ports. And so if you can't get a dedicated workstation for that, then you're going to tend to do it through one of the other mechanisms, batch load or web service call, and as an attached file so that you can use that as a means of communication between whoever is analyzing that data and whoever is doing the data management for it. ePRO can now be done directly within the ED system. We believe this is huge savings in cost and manageability. Today, an ePRO study, it can cost as much for 5% of the data, the 5% of data that's the diary data, as for the other 95%. And if you can handle it directly in the EDC system, then those cost disparities just melt away. And we would advocate eSource data to include a device ID and timestamp in each record, store that in the audit trail, and then you can automate the SDV of that, assuming you've got calibration records for those devices also in a database that you can access. So I'd just like to leave on a light note. Little cartoon I stole off the internet. A couple of dinosaurs watching the Ark sail away, saying, "Oh darn, was that today?" Don't miss the boat. Don't be these guys. It's very easy in this industry to say, "Oh, I'm going to wait for everything to settle down, see what everyone else is doing." This is happening today. People are doing this today. People are getting benefits from this today. And if you wait for everything to be ironed out and routine and so forth, you're going to be like these guys, and we don't want to see that happen. So with that, let me pass it back to Lisa for questions.
Thank you, Keith, and thank you, John, for your excellent presentations. And we are going to start the Q&A portion. So as a reminder, if you would like to ask a question, please type it into the red Q&A box, which can be found at the bottom of your presentation window. So we will start with, given that data captured in a clinical trial may be consolidated or a consolidation from multiple sources, how should the sources be documented?
Yes, hi, this is John. I'll take this one. I think the question really needs to be answered from probably two different aspects. From the technology side, and much of which I think is relevant to what Keith was just talking about. When you're looking at the clinical database itself, the origin of that data source really needs to be clear. The guidance made it really clear that the audit trail must accurately identify, the origin of that data. However, it also stated that the previously captured audit trail information of that data from the source system that it may have been in does not need to come forward into the EDC system. So essentially, once it actually lands in the EDC system or in the eCRF, that becomes the record of the document of record at that point. And as long as the origin of that data is clearly identified, that's enough from the clinical database perspective. However, I think from a planning perspective, there's something else here that really should be quite carefully documented as well. The protocol, the data management plan, the data validation plan really should all identify these sources clearly. There's obviously logistical considerations around each of these sources. There may be integrations that are built to get this data into your system. There's validation considerations with those integrations. All of that needs to be known up front and documented as part of the overall study documentation.
So in regard to manual direct data capture into an eCRF, how can it be established that the investigator maintains control over the source when the EDC systems most of them are web or browser based?
Yeah, hi, John here again. I'll take this question as well.
Okay.
This is actually, I think, a much more intriguing question because, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, if there is an area of ambiguity in the guidance documents, it tends to kind of focus around this kind of direct data capture into an eCRF. If you read the EMA's reflection paper around eSource and clinical trials, there's some language in there that actually talks about the investigator being in control of the source, and there are folks that feel that unless the investigator is in full control of that, essentially that database, that it may not be adequate level of control for the investigator. I think that actually, to be honest with you, is not really a logical viewpoint, in my opinion, at this point in the industry today. Almost all EDC systems that people are using are web-based at this point. Almost all of them are going to be either in control, either by the CRO or by the vendor that is hosting those applications for those clients. Yes, there are sponsor companies as well that are doing some of that hosting, but for the most part, the majority will be hosted with an external company. In my opinion, really what just needs to be in place is very clearly established segmentation of the users and responsibilities and permissions within those products. It has to be very clearly demonstrated that a sponsor has control over their clinical data from a capture perspective, and that the investigator has that level of control, and that the sponsor does not have any access to be able to modify that in any way. Now, I guess the catch with this, though, can be that oftentimes you do see that either sponsor personnel or CRO personnel are really doing the user administration and roles and permissions administration in these systems. But there's also has to be safeguards in these systems to not only audit trail the data, but also to audit trail all of the administration activities. So you know who touched what, who created what permissions, who created what roles, and who they were assigned to. And I think if all those safeguards are in place, that I think mitigates the question.
John, if I could chip in, I think you're right. There's some tension here between the principal investigator is in control of all the data and the practicalities of now where these sources might come from. So again, if I've given all my patients a Fitbit and that's streaming data directly to central database, then clearly the investigator isn't in the middle of that and shouldn't be in the middle of that. But if it all goes into the same EDC database that the investigator has to sign, then implicitly that data isn't released until the investigator approves of it. So I think the principle, well, the investigator should always have access, should always be able to review it, and ultimately signs to vouch for the integrity of that data is your control point. And again, if you send all that data into a central place rather than having all these disparate systems, then you've got one control point for the investigator to sign all those different sets of data.
Well, thank you both for those answers. On the next question, are there any performance implications associated with loading eSource data into the same database as it's being used for interactive access?
Okay, it's a technical question. Let me take that. Broadly, you always have to be conscious of performance. There's nothing worse than a slow website that someone's trying to use to enter data interactively. But technology these days is very good at multi-streaming different sources of data into the same database. So it's a well-designed system that shouldn't be a consideration. We routinely see lab file loads, 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 rows of data just coming in as part of everyday processing without impacting the site users. So broadly, you can do this simultaneously without impacting system performance.
Okay. And you had talked about the SDV toward the end there, Keith. Is there a way to automatically skip SDV for data loaded from eSource?
So again, we would advocate substituting some kind of central monitoring, some kind of program that checks, again, from the audit trail that the minimum you know about all these devices. If you want to do like a sampling of them, so, monitors are always scared of signing off on data they haven't actually seen, you could put it in the mix for a dynamic monitoring strategy. So you could say, well, I'm going to do 50% of the manually entered data and 5% of the eSource data. And because all of that goes through a randomization scheme, so you don't know which 5% it's going to be, then you're going to get some sampling that is going to force the monitor to go to some set of that eSource data and manually monitoring it. So some blend of central monitoring and throwing eSource data into your risk-based monitoring strategy at a lower percentage sampling, we think would cover it nicely.
Great. So another question regarding programming costs. Often the programming cost to import data can be prohibitive. Can you comment on this? I'm not sure who wants to take that one.
Well, maybe we can both take a stab at this one.
Okay.
From my perspective, systems that allow for specifically importing data as opposed to utilizing some type of programming interface like an API have very, very different costs associated with them. Most EDC products on the market today support some type of data import capability. Often that can be for those companies that are building their own studies on these EDC platforms. The mapping of those import specifications and working with an external vendor's data import files is not a huge cost really associated with that. And my team here at OmniComm, we build studies and often are creating these import capabilities for clients. And I would say there's not a huge cost associated with it. I think on the API side, maybe Keith can comment on this side. Certainly you can run into more expense associated with building very robust integrations.
Yes, I'd agree that batch loads are easier than API calls, which themselves are easier than instrument interfaces. You do need programming skills to get this handshaking right. We integrate with one IVR vendor where it took them 2 days, and that was fabulous. And we worked with another one where it took them 6 weeks to do broadly the same thing. So it's to be approached with caution, but ultimately is well proven. It's down to basically the skill of the vendors on each side and whether you've worked with them before. So always the first one you do takes a while, and then you just roll out another one, say, look, it's the same we did last time, except, the form names are different, and you can then turn these around very quickly. Similarly for lab loads, if you're dealing with central labs and they work with you on the last study, then setting up the next study is just syncing form names and visit codes and maybe lab test codes. So there's definitely advantage in establishing relationships with reliable vendors and then paying the benefit as you use those vendors over and over again on all the succeeding studies.
There's also just one final comment on that. I mean, there's also the aspect of looking for suppliers that are strong with the use of industry standards today, because that can play a key factor in the ability of a vendor system to talk well with your EDC vendor, right? If they both can handle, let's say, CDISC, ODM, XML file exchanges efficiently, then the overall cost for some of that integration can go down tremendously.
Okay, gentlemen, I think we have time for one last question. That question is regarding the patient data entry directly into the EDC. Sounds interesting. However, what are the regulatory informed consent patient computer literacy limitations? Do you think it would limit recruitment, and do you have any experiences around that?
So typically you would want a paragraph in the informed consent to say, by signing this, you're signing up for entering data. That would be no different from a standalone ePRO. So obviously the industry knows how to get consent for people to do ePRO, and basically in terms of what you're asking the patient to do, it's absolutely no different. From a compliance point of view, again, we believe that as long as you still have an audit trail, and that audit trail is ascribed to a person but doesn't expose personal identifying information, that you are whole with the requirements of basically the detention between Part 11 and HIPAA. So I guess we did interpret the regulations. If you look at Part 11, it says the audit trail should have the user name, and we've interpreted that as the user ID, because obviously if you put the user name there, then you've blown your HIPAA requirements wide open. So with that proviso, you interpret Part 11 where it says username as user ID, we believe compliance is rock solid.
Excellent. Well, thank you both for those insightful answers. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I want to thank the audience for attending and for your interesting questions, and for John and Keith, your presentations. Thank you so much. And I also want to thank our sponsor, OmniComm, for making today's webcast a valuable experience. This webcast will be available for on-demand viewing through June of 2016. You will receive an email from Applied Clinical Trials alerting you when this webcast will be available for replay. Please invite your colleagues who may have missed this live event by forwarding them the announcement. And I thank you again for attending today, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.